Welcome to the Honeyed Leaf, where every cup of tea comes with a story. I'm so glad you're here. Tonight we're returning to the peaceful village of Willowbrook, where Clara Whitmore is about to find herself drawn into another gentle mystery. Before we begin, find a comfortable position. Close your eyes if you'd like, and let yourself relax. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do. Just let the story carry you peacefully towards sleep. Now let's visit Willowbrook together. Chapter 1. A rainy afternoon discovery. February in Willowbrook brought grey skies and persistent drizzle, the kind of weather that made the honeyed leaf feel especially welcoming. Clara stood at her window, watching raindrops race down the glass, while inside the shop glowed warm with firelight and the gentle hum of quiet conversation. It was the perfect day for tea and books. Several customers had settled in for the afternoon, content to wait out the weather with a cup of something hot and a good novel. Mrs. Pembroke occupied her usual spot, working on her knitting between sips of Earl Grey. Mr. Chen was deep in his newspaper, his green tea cooling beside him. Clara was experimenting with a new winter blend today, black tea with dried orange peel, cloves and a hint of vanilla. The scent filled the shop with warm spice, and several customers had already requested second cups. Marmalade dozed on his cushion by the fire, occasionally opening one eye to check that his domain remained peaceful before returning to his nap. The bell above the door chimed, and Emma Sullivan hurried in, shaking water from her coat. Emma owned the village bookshop, Pages and Stories, just down the high street. She was in her late 20s, with dark, curly hair usually pulled back in a messy bun and an infectious enthusiasm for books. "Clara, thank goodness you're open," Emma said, rushing to the counter. "I need your help. Well, actually, I need tea first and then your help." "Come sit by the fire," Clara said warmly. "You look frozen. What can I get you?" "Something warming. Surprise me." Clara prepared a cup of her new spiced blend and brought it to Emma, who had claimed a table near the fireplace. Steam rose from the cup, and Emma wrapped her hands around it gratefully. "Perfect," she said after her first sip. "Now I can explain properly." Clara sat down across from her, curious. Emma looked excited rather than distressed, despite her dramatic entrance. "You know I've been reorganising the back room at the shop," Emma began. Clara nodded. Pages and Stories was housed in an old building that had been a bookshop for generations. The front room held new and recent releases, while the back room contained used and antique books. Emma had been talking for weeks about her project, to properly catalogue and organise the back room's inventory. Well, this morning I was going through boxes of books that have been in storage for years, stuff that belonged to the previous owner, Mr. Whitfield, before he sold the shop to me. He left behind boxes and boxes of books, said I could sell them or keep them or do whatever I wanted with them. "I remember you mentioning that when you bought the place," Clara said. "Right. I've been meaning to sort through them properly for ages, but you know how it is. The daily business keeps you busy, and the project keeps getting postponed. But with the weather so dreadful, I decided today was the day." Emma paused to take another sip of tea, clearly building to something. "And?" Clara prompted gently. "And I found something extraordinary, hidden in the bottom of one of the boxes, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. At first I thought it was just another old book, but when I unwrapped it..." Emma's eyes sparkled with excitement. "It's a handwritten journal from 1895, and it belonged to someone named Charlotte Ashford." Clara felt the familiar flutter of interest. Another old journal. Willowbrook seemed to be full of them. "What kind of journal?" she asked. "That's the interesting part. It's not a personal diary exactly. It's more of a... well, it's hard to describe. There are observations about the village, notes about people and events, some poetry, some sketches. But there are also what look like codes or puzzles scattered throughout, cryptic phrases, number sequences, drawings that might be maps or might just be doodles. Codes. This was different from the garden journals Clara had helped find before. "Yes, Or at least that's what they look like. And here's the really intriguing part. Every so often there are references to something called the collection, as if Charlotte was documenting where various items were hidden or stored. What kind of collection? That's just it, I don't know. The references are deliberately vague. The third volume is in its proper place. The letters remain where they were left. The paintings are safely kept, but no clear indication of what any of it means. Emma pulled a small notebook from her bag. I started making notes about the most interesting passages. Look at this one. She read aloud. Today I visited the old oak and confirmed the location. All remains undisturbed. Future generations will know where to look if they understand the pattern. Future generations, Clara repeated thoughtfully. So whatever this collection is, Charlotte meant for it to be found eventually. Exactly. It's like she created a treasure map, but in journal form, and deliberately obscured so only someone really paying attention would understand it. Clara leaned back in her chair, thinking. Tell me about Charlotte Ashford. Do you know anything about her? Not much. The name isn't familiar from village history, but I haven't had time to research properly. I only found the journal this morning, and I've been so excited about it that I couldn't concentrate on the shop. I finally locked up early and came straight here. Why me specifically? Clara asked, though she thought she knew the answer. Emma smiled. Because you helped Eleanor find the garden book, and you helped Margaret find her grandmother's journals. Beatrice says you have a knack for this sort of thing. Finding lost things, understanding mysteries. I don't know about a knack, Clara protested mildly. I'm just curious and persistent. That's exactly what we need. Clara, I think this journal might lead to something wonderful. Some hidden piece of village history, and I'd love your help figuring it out. Clara considered. The tea shop was quiet this afternoon, with most of her regulars already settled in and unlikely to leave in the rain. She could close a bit early if needed, and the mystery was certainly intriguing. I'd be happy to help, she said. When would you like to start? Now? Emma asked hopefully. If you can spare the time, we could go to the shop, I'll show you the journal, and we can start trying to make sense of it. Clara glanced around the honeyed leaf. Mrs. Now? Emma asked hopefully. If you can spare the time, we could go to the shop, I'll show you the journal, and we can start trying to make sense of it. Clara glanced around the honeyed leaf. Mrs. Pembroke was absorbed in her knitting. Mr. Chen showed no signs of moving. Old Tom Fletcher had dozed off in his corner chair. Let me make sure everyone has fresh tea, and then I can close up for an hour or so, Clara decided. 20 minutes later, Clara locked the door of the honeyed leaf, hung her back soon sign, and walked with Emma through the rain to Pages and Stories. The bookshop was one of Clara's favourite places in Willowbrook. It smelled of old paper and leather bindings, and every surface was covered with books. The front room was cosy and well organised, with comfortable reading chairs and good lighting. But the back room, which Emma unlocked with an old brass key, was something else. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling. More books were stacked on tables, tucked into corners, piled in boxes. It was organised chaos, the accumulated inventory of decades. I know it looks overwhelming, Emma said, navigating through the stacks with practised ease. But there's actually a system, sort of. Mr. Whitfield had his own method of organisation that made sense to him, if to no one else. She led Clara to a work table near the window, where an old leather-bound journal lay open beside a reading lamp. Next to it were the brown paper wrappings and several sheets of Emma's notes. Clara picked up the journal carefully. The leather was worn but still supple, and the pages had yellowed with age but remained intact. The handwriting was elegant, done with a careful hand and dark ink. She read the first page. This record is kept in the hope that what has been preserved will someday be understood. What cannot be spoken openly must be written in whispers. What cannot be shown must be hidden in plain sight. Let those with eyes to see, see. Charlotte Ashford, Willowbrook, 1895. It's deliberately cryptic from the very beginning, Clara observed. Right? Like she's setting up a puzzle for someone to solve. Emma pulled her chair closer. Look at the next few pages. She starts with what seems like ordinary observations about village life. Clara read entries about the weather, about village events, about people Charlotte knew. But interspersed among the mundane observations were those strange, cryptic phrases Emma had mentioned. The collection grows. 3 more volumes acquired and placed. The usual location. Met with J.H. today. He understands the importance of discretion. The paintings are secure. Visited the old chapel ruins. The stone with the marking remains. 6 paces north, 4 east. It's like 2 journals in one, Clara said. The surface level is a normal record of daily life, but underneath, there's this other story about hiding and preserving something. Exactly. And I think if we can decode the hidden story, we'll find something Charlotte left behind, something she wanted preserved but couldn't openly protect. Clara turned more pages, noting the dates. The journal covered approximately 1 year, from January to December 1895. Throughout, Charlotte made her cryptic references, always assuming the reader would understand what the collection meant, where the usual location was, who J.H. might be. "We need to research Charlotte Ashford," Clara said. "Find out who she was, what her life was like, what she might have been trying to preserve." "Beatrice?" Emma suggested. "Beatrice," Clara agreed. The library was their best resource for village history. They carefully wrapped the journal back in its brown paper. Emma locked up the shop, and together they hurried through the rain to the library. Beatrice looked up from the circulation desk as they entered, both slightly damp despite their umbrellas. "Clara, Emma, what brings you out in this weather? Though I suspect I can guess. You've found another mystery, haven't you?" Clara had to laugh. "Are we that predictable? Let's just say Willowbrook seems to have an endless supply of hidden history, and you seem to have a talent for uncovering it. What is it this time?" Emma explained about the journal while Beatrice listened with growing interest. When Emma mentioned Charlotte Ashford's name, Beatrice's eyebrows rose. Charlotte Ashford. Now that's a name I haven't heard in years. Let me check our archives. She disappeared into the back room and returned with several items. An old village directory from 1890, a collection of photographs in a protective folder, and a thin folder of papers. "Charlotte Ashford was quite a remarkable woman," Beatrice said, laying out the materials. "She was the daughter of the village doctor. Never married, which was unusual for the time, and apparently caused some gossip. She inherited her father's house when he died and lived there alone. Also unusual. She was known for being educated, independent, and somewhat eccentric." Beatrice opened the folder of papers. She corresponded with several suffragettes and was involved in early movements for women's education. She also, and this is interesting, was known for her private library. People mentioned it in their letters and memoirs. She had one of the best collections of books in the region. "Books?" Emma said excitedly. "So the collection might refer to books?" "Possibly. But look at this." Beatrice showed them a newspaper clipping from 1896. It was Charlotte Ashford's obituary. Clara read aloud. "Miss Charlotte Ashford, aged 42, passed away suddenly in her home. She will be remembered for her charitable works and her advocacy for women's education. Her estate, including her extensive library, was left to the village, though the exact disposition of her effects remains unclear. It is believed that many of her books and papers were dispersed among various families. The disposition remains unclear," Clara repeated, "and her collection was dispersed. So maybe Charlotte knew she was ill, knew her collection would be scattered, and created this journal as a record of where things were sent." "That would make sense," Beatrice said thoughtfully. "If she wanted certain items preserved, but couldn't ensure they'd all stay together, she might have created a sort of map of where everything went." Emma was practically bouncing with excitement. "So if we can decode her clues, we might be able to recover pieces of her collection. Books or documents she thought were important enough to hide and preserve." "It's a working theory," Clara said, "but we need to understand her system. The codes, the references, the locations. We need to think like Charlotte Ashford thought." Beatrice smiled. "Well then, you've come to the right place. Let's start researching." They settled in at a large table in the library's research room. Beatrice brought out maps of 1890s Willowbrook, directories, census records. anything that might help them understand Charlotte's world. As they worked, a picture of Charlotte Ashford began to emerge. She had been educated, independent, and passionate about books and women's rights. She had lived through a time when women's access to education and intellectual pursuits was limited. Her collection of books might have included works that were controversial, radical, or simply hard for women to obtain. By preserving and hiding these books, Charlotte might have been creating a secret library, a collection that could survive beyond her own life, waiting to be discovered by someone who would value it. "It's brilliant," Emma said softly. If she'd kept everything together in one place, her collection might have been dismissed. But by scattering it and leaving a coded record, she ensured it could be reconstructed by someone who cared enough to try. Clara looked at the journal, at Charlotte's careful handwriting, her deliberate clues. A woman over a century ago, working to preserve knowledge, to pass on what she valued, trusting that someday someone would understand. It was a legacy, hidden in plain sight, waiting patiently to be discovered. "Well then," Clara said, feeling that familiar sense of purpose. "Let's find Charlotte's collection." Chapter 2. Decoding the Clues. The rain continued through the evening, creating a cosy atmosphere in the library's research room. Beatrice had brought them tea and sandwiches, insisting they needed sustenance for their detective work. The three women spread Charlotte's journal and their research materials across the large table, ready to begin decoding the mystery. She opened the journal to the first page and began reading aloud while Emma and Beatrice took notes. The early entries from January 1895 were straightforward observations about winter weather and village life. But on January 15th, Charlotte wrote something different. 3 volumes secured with MP at the cottage by the stream. She understands their value. MP at the cottage by the stream, Emma repeated, writing it down. Do we know who MP might be? Beatrice consulted the 1890 village directory. Several possibilities. Mary Preston, Margaret Patterson, Martha Pemberton. Pemberton? Clara interrupted. Could that be related to Mrs. Pembroke's family? Very possibly. The Pembrokes have been in Willowbrook for generations. Beatrice made a note. We should ask Mrs. Pembroke if she knows anything about family members from the 1890s. They continued through the journal. Charlotte mentioned J.H. several times, usually in connection with paintings or artwork. She referred to the chapel ruins repeatedly, with specific instructions about pacing and directions. On March 3rd, she wrote something particularly intriguing. Visited E.W. at the manor. The items are safely stored in the library, second shelf from the window. She has promised to keep them for future generations. E.W. at the manor, Clara said. That could be Hartwell Manor, Eleanor's family. Eleanor Hartwell would be the right person to ask about that, Beatrice agreed. The journal entries continued through the spring and summer. Charlotte documented visits to various locations around the village, always with those careful, cryptic notations about items being secured or placed or hidden for safekeeping. One entry from June caught Clara's attention particularly. The bookshop proprietor, though unaware of the full scope, has agreed to keep certain volumes on the high shelves. They blend with his stock, but remain distinct to those who know the marking. The bookshop, Emma breathed. That's my shop. Or rather, the shop that became mine. In 1895 it would have been... She checked her records. Thomas Whitfield's shop. Mr. Whitfield's grandfather, I think. So there might be books from Charlotte's collection still in your shop? Clara asked. Hidden on the high shelves, marked somehow so they could be identified. Emma's eyes were bright with excitement. We need to check every book. Let's finish cataloguing the clues first, Beatrice suggested practically. Then we can plan our search strategy. They worked for another hour, creating a comprehensive list of every location Charlotte mentioned, every person identified by initials, every cryptic instruction. Patterns began to emerge. Charlotte had distributed her collection throughout the village, entrusting different items to different people. She'd chosen carefully. People she trusted, people who had resources to keep things safe, people who wouldn't ask too many questions. The collection itself seemed to include books, multiple references to volumes. paintings or artwork, mentioned with JH letters or papers, referred to as correspondence several times, and what Charlotte called documents of significance. But Charlotte had never explicitly stated what made these items important. Why hide them? Why go to such elaborate lengths to preserve them? It must have been controversial, Clara said thoughtfully. Whatever Charlotte was collecting and preserving, it was something that couldn't be openly displayed or discussed, something that needed to be hidden. Women's suffrage materials, Emma suggested. Political writings, radical literature. Possibly all of those, Beatrice said. Remember, this was 1895. Women couldn't vote, couldn't own property in their own names in many cases, had limited access to higher education. Literature advocating for women's rights, or even just books about women's intellectual capabilities, could be considered dangerous. So Charlotte created a secret library, Clara said slowly. A collection of materials important to women's education and rights, preserved by hiding them throughout the village. It was a beautiful and sad idea. Beautiful that Charlotte had cared enough to preserve this knowledge. Sad that it had been necessary to hide it. The question is, Emma said, how much of the collection still exists? How many of these hidden items have survived? Only one way to find out, Clara said. We start searching. They divided up the task. Emma would search the bookshop thoroughly, looking for volumes with Charlotte's marking system. Beatrice would search the library's oldest collections. Some books had been donated to the library in the early 1900s and might have come from Charlotte's dispersed estate. Clara would visit Eleanor Hartwell to ask about items that might have been stored at the manor, and she'd also talk to Mrs. Pembroke about her family history. We should check the chapel ruins too, Emma added, looking at Charlotte's repeated references to that location. She mentions it several times with specific pacing instructions. There might be something buried or hidden there. They agreed to meet again in 2 days to share what they'd found. As Clara walked back to the honeyed leaf through the dark, rainy evening, she felt energised despite the long day. Another mystery to solve, another piece of village history to uncover. Marmalade greeted her with indignant meows. He'd been alone all afternoon and had opinions about this. Clara fed him, made herself a light supper, and sat down with her notes about Charlotte Ashford. She thought about this woman who'd lived over a century ago, who'd loved books and learning, who'd fought for women's rights in her own quiet way. Charlotte had created a legacy by hiding it, trusting that someday someone would care enough to search. Clara would make sure that trust wasn't misplaced. Chapter 3. The search begins. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the rain having finally passed. Clara opened the honeyed leaf early, knowing Mrs. Pembroke would arrive at her usual time, and that this would be the perfect opportunity to ask about her family history. Sure enough, at exactly 9:15, Mrs. Pembroke appeared at the door. She settled into her familiar spot with a satisfied sigh. "Lovely to see sunshine again," she announced, though the rain was quite cosy while it lasted. Clara brought her the usual Earl Grey and almond biscuit, then sat down across from her. "Mrs. Pembroke, I wonder if I could ask you about your family history." "My family? How intriguing. What would you like to know, dear?" Clara explained about Charlotte Ashford's journal, being careful not to reveal too much about the specific contents. She simply said they'd found references to someone with the initials MP, who had lived in a cottage by the stream in the 1890s. Mrs. Pembroke's face lit up with interest. "MP? That could well be my great-great-grandmother, Martha Pemberton. She did live in a cottage by the stream. Ivy Cottage, actually, before it passed to other families." "The same cottage where Margaret Thornbury lives now?" Clara asked, surprised at this connection. "The very same. My family lived there for 2 generations before selling it. I remember my grandmother talking about Martha. She was apparently quite an independent woman, ran a small dressmaking business from the cottage, unusual for the time." "Did your grandmother ever mention Martha knowing a Charlotte Ashford?" Mrs. Pembroke thought for a moment. "The name sounds familiar. I believe there were some old books that came down through the family, supposedly from a woman my great-great-grandmother had known. But that was ages ago. They might have been lost or given away decades past. Do you know what happened to Martha's belongings after she died?" They would have passed to her daughter, my great-grandmother, then to my grandmother, and so on. But things scatter over the generations, don't they? Families divide estates, items are sold or donated. I couldn't tell you what still exists from Martha's time. Clara made a mental note to talk to Margaret. If Martha Pemberton had lived in Ivy Cottage and had known Charlotte, there might be items from Charlotte's collection still hidden somewhere in that cottage or its garden. After Mrs. Pembroke left, Clara closed the shop for a few hours and walked to Hartwell Manor. Eleanor was in her conservatory, tending to seedlings. "Clara, what a pleasant surprise. Come in, I'll make tea." They settled in the conservatory, surrounded by green growing things and winter sunshine streaming through the glass. Clara explained about Charlotte Ashford's journal and the reference to E.W. at the manor, with items stored in the library. Eleanor's eyes widened with interest. "Charlotte Ashford. I know that name from family letters. My great-great-grandmother, Emma Whitmore Hartwell, mentioned her several times. They were friends, apparently, both interested in women's suffrage and education reform." "E.W.," Clara said. "Emma Whitmore. That fits perfectly. Follow me," Eleanor said, standing up. "If Charlotte left items here, they'd be in our library." The library at Hartwell Manor was a beautiful room, lined with books from floor to ceiling. Large windows on one wall let in abundant light. Eleanor walked to the far end to the shelves near the windows. "Second shelf from the window," Clara murmured, remembering Charlotte's note. Eleanor pulled over a small ladder. "I've never paid particular attention to these books. They've been here since before my time. Let's see what we have." She began pulling out volumes, examining them carefully. Most were ordinary books from the late 1800s, novels, poetry, histories. But then Eleanor paused, holding a slim volume bound in dark green cloth. "This is interesting," she said, bringing it down the ladder. "There's a small mark on the spine, a tiny symbol I've never noticed before." Clara looked closely. Embossed very faintly on the spine was a small mark that looked like a combination of the letters C and A intertwined. "C.A.," Clara said. "Charlotte Ashford. This must be her marking system." They searched more carefully, finding 3 more books with the same subtle mark. The titles were revealing. A Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft, The Subjection of Women by John Stuart Mill, and 2 volumes of essays about women's education. "These were controversial in their time," Eleanor said softly, "arguing for women's equality, for women's right to education and independence. Charlotte was preserving forbidden knowledge." "Not forbidden exactly," Clara said, "but certainly not encouraged. Books like these would have been hard for women to obtain, possibly disapproved of by family members or society. Charlotte was creating access." They found 2 more volumes, both collections of women's poetry and essays. All bore Charlotte's subtle mark. "These have been here for over a century," Eleanor said, "preserved in plain sight. My family kept them safe without even knowing they were special." "That was Charlotte's genius," Clara said. "She hid them among regular books, marked them subtly, and trusted that they'd survive until someone came looking." Eleanor carefully set aside the books they'd found. "Please take them, or at least photographs of them. They should be part of documenting Charlotte's collection." As Clara walked back through the village, she thought about the pattern emerging. Charlotte had been strategic. She'd placed her books with people who were sympathetic to her cause. Emma Hartwell, Martha Pemberton, others who would keep them safe even if they didn't fully understand why. That afternoon, Emma appeared at the Honeyed Leaf, practically bursting with excitement. "I found them," she announced. "At least a dozen books with Charlotte's mark, hidden on the highest shelves in the back room. Most of them are about women's rights, education, political philosophy. Clara, it's exactly what you guessed. A secret library of feminist literature." "That's wonderful, Emma." "And that's not all. One of the books had a note tucked inside, written by Charlotte herself, dated December 1895, just before she died." Emma pulled out a carefully preserved piece of paper, protected in a plastic sleeve. Clara read the note aloud. "To whoever finds these books, I entrust them to your care. They represent knowledge and ideas that women of my generation have struggled to access. I have hidden them not from shame, but from necessity. The world is not yet ready to fully embrace women's intellectual equality, but it will be. When that day comes, I hope these books will be found, studied and celebrated. Until then, they are seeds planted for future harvest. With hope for a better future, Charlotte Ashford. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Charlotte had known she was dying. She'd written this note as a message to the future, trusting that someday circumstances would change, that someone would search, that her careful preservation would matter. "We need to recover as much of the collection as we can," Clara said firmly. "And we need to make sure Charlotte's story is told. She deserves to be remembered." Chapter 4. The Chapel Ruins. Over the next few days, Clara, Emma and Beatrice worked to locate as many items from Charlotte's collection as possible. Beatrice found several volumes in the library's oldest donations. Margaret reported finding 3 books tucked away in a cupboard at Ivy Cottage, all bearing Charlotte's mark. But there remained one significant mystery: Charlotte's repeated references to the chapel ruins. The old chapel sat on the edge of the village, abandoned since a new church was built in the 1850s. The stone ruins were considered picturesque and historical, but no one had paid them much attention in decades. Charlotte's journal mentioned the ruins 6 times, always with specific instructions about pacing and directions. The most detailed entry read, "The documents are secured beneath the marked stone. 6 paces north from the doorframe, 4 east. The stone bears my father's initials. Only excavation will reveal what lies beneath." On a bright Saturday morning, Clara, Emma, Beatrice and Margaret met at the chapel ruins to investigate. Eleanor had offered to come as well, bringing her gardening tools, which might prove useful for any excavation needed. The chapel ruins were beautiful in the morning light. Most of the building had crumbled away, but portions of the walls still stood, and the doorway remained intact, marking where the entrance had once been. 6 paces north from the doorframe, Clara read from her notes. Charlotte's paces, which might have been smaller than ours. They experimented with different stride lengths. "Now we look for a stone with initials," Emma said. "Charlotte's father was a doctor. What was his name?" Beatrice consulted her notes. "Dr. Henry Ashford, so we're looking for H.A." They spread out, examining the scattered stones. Many were weathered smooth, their surfaces worn by more than a century of weather. But finally, Margaret called out, "Here! There's something carved on this stone." They gathered around. The stone was about 2 feet square, flat, lying among the grass and other scattered ruins. Very faintly, almost worn away, were the letters H.A. "This is it," Clara breathed. Eleanor had brought proper tools, including a small spade and a trowel. They carefully began clearing the dirt and grass from around the stone. "We should be careful," Beatrice cautioned. "If there's something buried here, we don't want to damage it." The stone was heavier than it looked. Working together, they managed to shift it aside, revealing the soil beneath. About 6 inches down, Clara's trowel hit something solid. "There's something here," she said. Carefully, moving slowly and gently, they excavated around the object. It turned out to be a metal box, approximately a foot square, sealed with wax. They lifted it out and sat back, looking at each other with a mixture of excitement and reverence. This box had been buried for over 120 years, hidden by Charlotte Ashford, waiting to be found. "Should we open it here?" Emma asked. "Let's take it somewhere dry and safe," Eleanor suggested. "My conservatory. We can clean it up properly and document everything carefully." They reburied the stone to mark the location, gathered their tools, and carried the box carefully to Hartwell Manor. In Eleanor's conservatory, they set up a workspace with clean cloths and good lighting. Eleanor brought tea and sandwiches. Beatrice carefully cleaned the outside of the box, removing dirt and vegetation. The metal had rusted slightly, but was still intact. The wax seal had done its job. The box appeared to be tightly closed. "Should we break the seal?" Clara asked. "I think Charlotte would want us to," Emma said softly. "She buried this to be found. She'd want us to see what's inside." Beatrice carefully broke the wax seal and opened the box. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth, were documents, papers, letters, and what appeared to be a small bound manuscript. All were remarkably well preserved, protected by Charlotte's careful preparations. They unwrapped everything with gentle hands. The documents were extraordinary. Personal letters between Charlotte and various suffragettes discussing strategy and organisation. Essays written by Charlotte herself about women's education. Copies of political pamphlets advocating for women's voting rights. A small notebook containing names and addresses of women involved in the suffrage movement. And most remarkably, a manuscript titled A Woman's Voice, Essays on Freedom and Equality, written entirely by Charlotte. She was a writer, Margaret said softly, an activist, a political thinker, and she had to hide all of it. They spent hours examining the documents, reading Charlotte's words, understanding her passion and her frustration. The letters revealed a network of women working quietly for change, supporting each other, sharing ideas and strategies. Charlotte's essays were eloquent and forceful, arguing for women's right to education, to property ownership, to political participation. She wrote with intelligence and passion, citing philosophy and history, building careful logical arguments. "These should be published," Emma said. "Charlotte's writing deserves to be read." "I'll contact some academic publishers," Margaret offered. "This is significant historical material, and Charlotte's essays have value beyond just historical interest. Her arguments are still relevant." As the afternoon wore on, they catalogued everything carefully. Beatrice would ensure the documents were properly conserved. Emma would compile a complete inventory of all the books they'd found. Margaret would research Charlotte's life more thoroughly and write her biography. And Clara would make sure Charlotte's favourite tea blend was recreated, so that when they held an exhibition about Charlotte's life and work, visitors could taste something Charlotte herself might have enjoyed. Chapter 5. Charlotte's Legacy. 2 months later, the library hosted an exhibition titled Hidden in Plain Sight, Charlotte Ashford and Her Secret Library. The community room was filled with displays about Charlotte's life, her collection, and her activism. The books from the collection were displayed in glass cases, showing Charlotte's subtle marking system. Her buried documents were featured prominently, with selected passages from her essays printed large enough for visitors to read easily. Emma had created a display about the bookshop's role in preserving Charlotte's books. Eleanor contributed information about her ancestor Emma Whitmore Hartwell and her friendship with Charlotte. Margaret had compiled a comprehensive biography, revealing Charlotte as a complex, brave, intelligent woman working for change in difficult times. The exhibition opening drew a large crowd. Several scholars came from universities, interested in Charlotte's writings. Local residents came out of curiosity and stayed to learn about this remarkable woman. Clara had set up a tasting station featuring Charlotte's blend, a tea she'd researched and recreated based on references in Charlotte's journal. It was a delicate blend of Earl Grey with lavender and a hint of lemon, elegant and thoughtful, much like Charlotte herself. Mrs. Pembroke tried the tea and declared it excellent. "To think my great-great-grandmother helped preserve these books," she said proudly. Martha would be pleased to know her part in this story is remembered. The mayor gave a short speech about Charlotte's contribution to the village's history. Emma spoke about the discovery of the journal and the search for the collection. Margaret presented her findings about Charlotte's life and work. But the most moving moment came when Beatrice read aloud from one of Charlotte's essays. "I write this knowing it may never be read in my lifetime. I hide these books understanding they may never be found. But I persist in hope. Hope that the world will change. Hope that women will one day have the freedom to read, to learn, to think, to speak, to participate fully in society. Hope that someone, someday, will find what I have preserved and will understand why it mattered. We plant seeds for forests we may never walk in. We light candles whose glow we may never see. But we persist, because the work matters, because knowledge matters, because justice matters. To whoever finds these words, thank you for searching, thank you for caring, thank you for remembering." There was silence when Beatrice finished reading, then genuine applause. Clara looked around the room at the faces of the villagers, seeing understanding and respect for Charlotte's courage and vision. After the formal presentations, people wandered through the exhibition, reading the displays, examining the books, discussing what they'd learned. Clara found herself in conversation with a young woman, perhaps 20, who was studying the display of Charlotte's essays. "This is incredible," the young woman said. "Charlotte was fighting for things we take for granted now. The right to education, to vote, to own property, to have a voice. And she had to hide her work, bury it literally because it was so radical for her time. But she trusted the future," Clara said. She believed things would change, that someday her work would be valued. And she was right. That takes courage. To work for a future you'll never see. Clara thought about that conversation for days afterward. Charlotte had indeed been courageous, not in dramatic ways, but in the quiet daily work of preserving knowledge, of trusting the future, of believing that small acts mattered. In the weeks following the exhibition, wonderful things happened. A university press agreed to publish Charlotte's collected essays as a book. The library created a permanent Charlotte Ashford collection, housing all the books and documents that had been recovered. Emma dedicated a corner of the bookshop to Charlotte's memory, displaying some of her marked books and telling her story. Margaret completed her thesis, which now included chapters about both her grandmother's garden journals and Charlotte's hidden library. She'd found a connecting theme: women preserving knowledge, passing it forward, creating legacies through careful, quiet work, and Clara added Charlotte's blend to her regular offerings at the Honeyed Leaf. It became popular, especially among the book club members who met at the shop monthly. They liked the idea of drinking tea while discussing books, knowing they were honouring Charlotte's memory. One quiet evening in early spring, Clara sat in her flat above the shop, reviewing everything that had happened since Emma had rushed in with news of the journal. They'd recovered most of Charlotte's collection, perhaps 30 books and all the buried documents. They'd told Charlotte's story, given her the recognition she deserved. But more than that, they'd connected with something timeless. The desire to preserve knowledge, the hope that the future would be better, the trust that someone someday would care enough to search. Clara thought about the other mysteries she'd helped solve: Eleanor's garden book, Margaret's grandmother's journals, and now Charlotte's hidden library. They were all variations on the same theme: knowledge preserved, often by women, often hidden or overlooked, waiting to be rediscovered. It made Clara think about her own work at the Honeyed Leaf. In her own small way, she was creating something similar. A place where knowledge was shared over tea, where conversations happened and connections were made, where the old and the new came together. She wasn't hiding books or burying documents, but she was preserving something. The tradition of gathering, of conversation, of community. The idea that slow, quiet spaces mattered in a rushed world, that tea and talk and time were valuable. It was a legacy, she realised. Not a grand one, but real and meaningful. And perhaps someday, decades or centuries from now, someone would look back at the Honeyed Leaf and understand what Clara had been trying to create. A place of comfort and connection, preserved through daily acts of care. Marmalade jumped into her lap, purring. Clara scratched behind his ears and smiled. "What do you think, Marmalade? Are we creating a legacy?" Marmalade, unconcerned with legacies but very concerned with dinner time, simply meowed his opinion on the matter. Clara laughed and got up to feed him. Tomorrow would bring more customers, more conversations, more opportunities to serve tea and build community. The work continued, day by day, cup by cup. And somewhere in the village, Charlotte's books sat on library shelves, her essays waited to be read, her story lived on, hidden no longer, found, preserved, celebrated. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything Charlotte had hoped for. The spring evening settled gently over Willowbrook. In Hartwell Manor, Eleanor sat reading one of Charlotte's books, inspired to learn more about women's history. At the library, Beatrice was cataloguing more donations to the Charlotte Ashford collection. Several families had found old books in their attics and brought them in. In the bookshop, Emma was closing up for the night, straightening the Charlotte Ashford Memorial Corner one last time before heading home. And in Ivy Cottage, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, writing about women who preserved knowledge across generations, drawing connections between her grandmother, Mary Henderson, Charlotte Ashford, and countless others. The village held its stories close, valued its history, remembered its remarkable people. And Clara was grateful to be part of it all, helping to uncover what had been hidden, to celebrate what had been overlooked, to connect the past with the present in meaningful ways. She prepared for bed, feeling that deep contentment that came from work that mattered. Tomorrow, the honeyed leaf would open again. There would be tea to brew and customers to serve. Perhaps there would even be another mystery waiting to be discovered, another piece of village history ready to be found. But tonight, there was just peace. The satisfaction of a mystery solved, a story told, a legacy honoured. Clara fell asleep thinking about Charlotte Ashford, hoping that somehow across the years, Charlotte knew her work had been found, that her trust in the future had been justified, that someone had cared enough to search, to understand, to remember. In the morning, Willowbrook would wake to a beautiful spring day. The village green would fill with people going about their daily business. The church bells would ring. Children would walk to school. Life would continue in its gentle, eternal patterns. And in the honeyed leaf, Clara would brew Charlotte's blend, serving it to customers who would carry Charlotte's story forward, one cup of tea at a time. The legacy continued. The knowledge was preserved. The connection held strong across time. All was well in Willowbrook. The end.